What to do when a long-term relationship ends abruptly. And I guess the reason that I want to talk about this is because oftentimes there's not a lot of people in the industry that do talk about this. So what I've done for you is I've put together a list of reasons for why exes end up ending long-term relationships. And we're going to talk in depth about those reasons, but more importantly, I think there's this need for closure or this need for what do I do next. Oftentimes the people coming to this website are caught in this crossroads where a part of them wants to just simply get over their ex, get over their breakup, and then the other half wants to win their exes back. So what we're going to do is help you understand what's really going on in your ex's head on why they ended a long-term relationship rather abruptly. And then after we're done doing that, we're going to give you some advice, or rather I'm going to give you some advice on how to go forward and making a decision that's best for you. So let's go back in time and revisit your breakup. So ultimately, I've put together a list of 10 reasons for why an ex would abruptly end a long-term relationship. And I think the key word there is long-term. We're not talking about a relationship that just started 3 months ago. And we're talking most of the time long-term relationships that have lasted a year to years. Why would an ex all of a sudden come out of the blue and say, I don't want you anymore? I don't want this relationship anymore. So the first reason is, I think, the most obvious one, which is they think they can do better than you. Now, this one is sort of the universal reason I like to teach my clients or talk to my clients about, because what is a breakup if not an admission that someone thinks that they can do better than you? The interdependence theory teaches us that human beings are very cost and benefit oriented when it comes to our own personal love lives. We're always looking for someone that can bring the most benefit but reduce the most costs. And usually when you're making a decision like that, you're looking at 3 types of criteria: how satisfied you are in the relationship, are there better alternatives out there, and how much you've invested into the relationship. And what's interesting about that is if you've invested a lot into the relationships, which a long-term relationship would seem to lend credence to that fact, usually that is the most important factor. You can be unsatisfied in the relationship. You can believe that there's a better alternative out there. But if you have invested so much into the relationship, it always kind of causes you to stay longer. And what's happening here is if your ex can think they can do better than you, usually we're finding that they're pretty checked out by the time that they are having these thoughts. Now, there's always a wavelength difference. You oftentimes don't realize that this is going on, and it kind of catches you off guard because you're on a different wavelength than them. But usually the signs to kind of check for here isn't so much that they're flirting with other people, though that can happen, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. It's more the fact that they're checked out. They're not as interested in spending time with you anymore. They're not, buying gifts that they maybe did at the beginning of the relationship, because that shows monetary investment. Those are the kind of things that you want to keep an eye out for. Those are the kind of things that oftentimes lead up to them starting to think, you know what, there is someone better out there for me. I can find someone that can meet my needs better. Ultimately, this is the ultimate version of the grass is greener syndrome, which we've talked a lot about. But let's move on to reason number 2, which is the stability and mystery scale. So this is a concept that I came up with a couple of years ago that basically highlights something that we've seen across breakups when we've started studying breakups, and that's the fact that there's this paradox that exists within each human being. We each have a need for stability. We want someone that we can kind of curl up on the couch with when it's raining, sit in all day and just, watch Netflix. And sometimes there's no greater beauty than having someone that you don't want to go out with. Sometimes you just want to stay in. Now, if that sounds like a nightmare to you, don't worry, I've got you covered, because that's where the adventure and the mystery comes into play. So we have this need for stability, but we also have this need for spontaneity and adventure and excitement and adrenaline. And sometimes these needs are competing. And I always try to tell my clients that each person has an individual percentage in which they kind of gravitate towards. So sometimes people will be 60% stability, 40% mystery. That's what they're looking for in a partner. Sometimes people want to be 80% mystery, 20% stability. But what almost always happens is when your ex falls in love with you, they're falling in love with potentially the thing that you aren't. So subconsciously, maybe you recognize that your ex loves to go out. They're very extracurricular. They're very extroverted, if you will. And so you play to that, but it's not who you are internally. And so as you enter this long-term relationship with your ex, they're going to sit there and expect you to be spontaneous all the time. But if that's not who you are, and you kind of naturally gravitate back towards your stability side, which is, a lot of people think it's boring, but I don't think so. I think it's more just like, I'm always going to be there for you. That can kind of turn an ex off, because they're going to sit there and think you're not who you were at the beginning of the relationship. And that can be a reason that sort of the cracks begin to form, and they can end a long-term relationship abruptly. Reason number 3 is that things have grown kind of boring. This is actually specifically meant for long-term relationships, because oftentimes in long-term relationships, you do get stuck into those routines. And if you're in a long-term relationship, especially if you're living together with your ex or living together with your partner, sometimes things have a tendency to grow quite boring. You want more of that mystery. You want more of that spontaneity. And when it doesn't come, that kind of creates this narrative within where you're sitting there and thinking, you know what, I'm not sure I want to do this anymore. And I think one interesting thing that not a lot of people talk about is the fact that most of the time when an ex breaks up with you, they're not going to tell you the real reason for why they broke up with you. They fear that you won't be able to handle the truth. So they make up half-truths. They tell you half of the puzzle, so to speak. And you're left trying to reach in the dark, trying to understand, well, why did they leave me? Well, it could be that you're just, the routine is boring to them. They want to change. The 4th reason we've seen is the pressure of settling down. This is more specific within men than women. So what I mean by that is oftentimes women, since their time is just naturally more valuable, they're pushing to settle down. They're wanting marriage. They're wanting children. They're wanting the whole 9 yards. And sometimes, especially when you have avoidant exes, and to kind of pause here and look at avoidance in general, people who have avoidant attachment styles really value their independence more than anything else. So anytime someone comes in and threatens that independence, they have a tendency to push the partner away. So if you're noticing you're in this long-term relationship and for the first time ever you pushed, hey, what are we? What are we moving towards? Are we going to get married? We don't have to do it right now, but I just want sort of the assurance that in the future that could potentially happen. If all of a sudden your ex breaks up with you, you pretty much have an avoidant ex because you're threatening that independence. And when their independence is threatened, like I said, they tend to push you away. Now, the best thing to do with avoidant people is simply just to give them time. Let them deal with their own emotions. They're not going to have the nostalgic reverie that you want them to have until they actually feel like you've moved on, which is this really warped way of thinking, but it helps you understand the way that they actually do think. So that was the 4th reason. The 5th reason is they've learned everything about you and there are no more layers to peel back. This is actually something that I didn't personally come up with. A good friend of mine came up with. So the situation goes like this. My friend, he was dating this girl and he told me that she might be the one. Things were going extremely well. You know, the way he was talking about her, you could just tell he was madly in love. And so this was during the pandemic. So we didn't talk for a couple of months. And then after a couple of months go by, we got on the phone again. We just started talking and it was great. And then I just naturally asked, I said, hey, how's things going with that girl? And he told me, he said, it's okay. Which didn't seem like much at the time. But when you actually heard the tone of voice that he used and just sort of like how unexcited he was, my spider sense started tingling and I started probing, just naturally because it's what I do. And he ultimately told me, yeah, things just aren't the same as they used to be. And I got really curious because I wanted to help women specifically understand what a man goes through when they're considering going through a breakup. And he was very much considering breaking up with the girl. And so I asked him, I said, well, what's going on? And he said that she's kind of shallow. And I said, okay, well, didn't you know that to begin with? And he said, yeah, but the thing was, at that point, I didn't know everything I knew about her. So it's when I learned everything about her and I felt like I kind of bared into her soul and there were no more layers to peel back, things just kind of became boring. And I think this is kind of an interesting insight because a lot of times people don't look at it that way. They look at it like, I want to show my ex everything about me. The truth is, though, there is an element of mystery, kind of going back to that stability and mystery scale. There's always an element of interest when you realize there's more layers to peel back. And when you feel like you've gotten to the center of the person's soul, it just becomes kind of boring. And so that might be a potential reason for why your long-term relationship has ended. So you've been in this long-term relationship. Your ex thinks that they've been with you and they know everything about you that there is to know, and there's no more layers to peel back. There's nothing more to learn. Well, we actually have ways, going forward that you can sort of fix that, but let's move on. The sixth reason for why an ex would abruptly end a relationship is their feelings aren't the same as they once were. Usually this doesn't happen all at once. It's a very gradual thing, and it does kind of, you'll notice a lot of these reasons kind of synergize. They kind of build off one another. So kind of going forward with that, peeling back the layers and there being nothing left, I think that's sort of what happens. Channeling from my own personal experience. I'm trying not to use names here so that I don't offend anyone. I was dating this girl, and we weren't specifically in a relationship, but we were in that talking phase, and I knew for a fact that she wanted to be in a relationship. And at first, there were feelings from my end and from her end. But after, I guess, I peeled back all the layers, I just found that the feelings I had at the beginning weren't the same as they once were. And if you're going to ask me to be honest with you about why, I think it does directly correlate to peeling back the layers. And also, one of the other things that we're going to talk about in a little bit is the reality versus the expectations sort of idea. But ultimately, what happens here usually is if you're in a long-term relationship, you feel like you've known or know everything you can know about the person. You'll kind of have this epiphany one day and realize, your feelings aren't the same as they were at the beginning. And this is kind of an irrational thought because the truth is no one's feelings will ever be the same as they were at the beginning. And usually the best relationships are the ones that can overcome this and can find new ways of looking at a relationship. But for the most part, a lot of times, especially in millennials, we're finding that after enough time goes by, if your ex learns everything there is to know about you and feels like they've peeled back all the layers and realizes their feelings aren't the same as they were at the beginning, that could be a trigger for why they abruptly end a relationship. Reason number 7, which is the relationship has grown so toxic. I'm actually seeing this more so with two types of couples. This is the ones that are very early in college and the ones that are just two anxious people being together, anxious and avoidance being together. Here's how this works. Your relationship has grown so toxic. That means it's plagued with fights. It seems like every day is another fight. And sometimes it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where you are aware of the toxic aspect of it, but you're not letting go of the relationship. You're holding on to it, but you can't help yourself personally, so that you end up being the one to initiate a lot of the arguments and the fights. And it almost becomes this weird dynamic. And I think understanding how anger works is an important trigger for understanding why fights are happening so frequently. So here's what we know about anger. Anger is almost like this addictive quality. It sounds weird, I know, but just bear with me here. It's addictive because in a way it makes you feel good. So imagine a situation where you and I are dating, and I say to you, you're dumb. right? Or why are you so dumb? Or why are you acting that way? That statement in and of itself is implying that you're dumb and I'm smart. Why are you acting so childish? You're a child, I'm an adult, which is really, really weird. You get what I'm saying here. Oftentimes when an ex gets angry at you, it's their weird coping mechanism to project the problems onto you instead of taking ownership of the problems that they themselves have caused. Now, not every situation is like this, but oftentimes when you get into this toxic relationship, it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy where you yourself are feeding into it, because in a way, getting into an argument with your ex feels good because you, number one, are standing up for yourself, so to speak, and number two, you are in a way making yourself feel better about yourself. It's a weird coping mechanism. And eventually someone who is in a toxic relationship just can't take it anymore and they break it off. So that's oftentimes why that breakup occurs. Sign number 8, or reason number 8, which is reality versus expectations. One of my favorite movies, probably my favorite romantic comedy movie ever, is the movie 500 Days of Summer. And I love it because it's so valuable for this concept, which is we're talking about breakups. And oftentimes the entire movie is about a breakup, about this guy who's basically reliving his experience of dating this girl. And what's interesting about that is there's this scene in that movie called the reality versus expectation scene. So here's the setup. Basically, the main character, the protagonist, has gone through a breakup. It's been a few months. He's super depressed. Everyone around him is just annoyed by the fact that he's so depressed about breaking up with this girl, or the fact that this girl broke up with him. And then he runs into the girl. And the girl, they have this really fun interaction. And the girl invites him to go to this rooftop dinner party. And all of a sudden, he's not depressed anymore. He's really excited to go to this party, and he kind of goes and finds the right jacket and everything. And then the scene begins, the reality versus expectation scene. So the expectation is that he's going to go to this rooftop party. He's going to basically rekindle things with his ex-girlfriend, and then they're going to live happily ever after. But the reality is different. He goes there and finds out that she's actually engaged to someone else, and she's just being this really nice person and trying to invite him to this experience, and hopefully he can find someone new at this rooftop party outside of her. So oftentimes this reality versus expectation things, the reason I bring this scene up is because I find it happens a lot, specifically in breakups like this, where an abrupt breakup occurs. The reason is because oftentimes the idea of dating you potentially is more enthralling than the reality of it. So we oftentimes, our minds are very amazing tools. We oftentimes have the ability to daydream about what things will potentially be like, but then when it actually occurs, we're kind of like, that's it? There's almost this disappointment. And so sometimes we get stuck into these relationships, and sometimes long-term relationships, where we keep waiting for our expectations to meet reality, but it never quite happens. And that's when the hard decision occurs. That's why that abrupt breakup occurs. Let's move on to reason number, 9 now? Which is flirting or cheating. This one is probably the most obvious one of the bunch. Usually an ex will abruptly break up with you if flirting or cheating is involved, if they catch you explicitly flirting with other people or explicitly cheating with other people. But this is also a double-edged sword. If they're cheating or they're flirting, there's a certain amount of guilt that they carry around within themselves. And if you've ever experienced the amount of just that feeling of guilt that you're carrying around, it can be all-encompassing. It can be an action driver. It can drive you to break up with this person. Rather than admit that you cheated on this person, it's easier to break up with this person very abruptly. There's not too much more to dive into here. I mean, it is what it is. Your ex is excessively flirting with other people and maybe finding, that mystery or adventure that they're missing out on with you and this other person, so they leave, or they're simply cheating because of that. There's a lot. We can get into the reasons for why people cheat later. I don't think that's super relevant right here, because usually most of the people aren't going to be experience abrupt breakups because their ex is cheating on them. Usually, the number one culprit is actually reason number 10, which is your anxious behaviors. So in order to understand this, we need to understand a little bit about attachment styles and attachment theory. So there's 4 core attachment styles. You have secure attachment style, anxious, avoidant, and fearful. We're not going to really talk so much about secure attachment styles because really that's sort of the holy grail. That's what everyone should be sort of trying to move towards. But what we're finding is most of our personal clients have extremely anxious behaviors. So what do extremely anxious behaviors look like? Well, simply put, anxious attachments tend to get overly attached to their partners. So they place an extreme emphasis on romantic relationships. They have a harder time getting over a breakup. Their common behaviors are going to be like they're super clingy, they're demanding, they're very jealous, or they're easily upset by small issues. We've all experienced probably in our past someone who just can't get over a breakup and they just constantly call time, like every single day, leaving a voicemail or blowing up your phone through texting. Sometimes they're even as crazy as if you block them, they'll get a whole new number and text you, which is just a bad look, but those types of people have anxious behaviors. So oftentimes those anxious behaviors aren't really occurring after a breakup. They're occurring during a relationship, but they're not occurring from like you broke up with them and then they're texting you. This is happening in the relationship. So oftentimes they're getting extremely jealous anytime you're talking to someone else of the opposite sex. They're extremely demanding about your time. Why weren't you on time here? Why weren't you on time there? They're the type of person that is going to literally stand outside of the bathroom door when you're using the bathroom because they're worried that you're sitting there and texting someone else. They always let their mind go to the worst case scenario. They're very upset by small issues. But what's interesting, there's almost a paradox within attachment behaviors or anxious behaviors because they also care so deeply about the relationship that it kind of sucks you in. And, you really do believe that they love you, and they do. They value the relationship with you so much higher than maybe they should, even above themselves. So oftentimes, if you have exhibited these anxious behaviors, and we have found that over 80 to 90% of our clients have anxious attachment styles, this could be one of the triggers for why they broke up with you. But also, it's kind of a weird topic to broach. It's super offensive to say someone, you need to stop being so clingy or demanding or jealous. You have an anxious attachment style. It's getting on my nerves when they know you're just going to come back with, well, you should love me for the way I am. But here's the point. Understanding and identifying why your long-term relationship ended abruptly is only part of what you need to do. Because understanding isn't the same thing as knowing what to do next. So here's oftentimes what I tell my clients they should be doing. If they find themselves in a situation where they're not really sure if they should be trying to get over their ex or trying to get their ex back. And that's always to implement a no contact rule immediately after the breakup. Now, I know that sounds super traditional and not very innovative, but I think where our innovation from ex-boyfriend recovery comes into play is the fact of we view the no contact rule very differently than most people. So most people view the no contact rule as this period of time where they're ignoring their ex, and as they're ignoring their ex, they'll make their ex miss them. But when we actually talk to our success stories, people who have used the no contact rule, gone through a program, successfully won their exes back, or even simply just got over the breakup, they always said that the no contact rule for them was more about outgrowing their ex. So the way we view the no contact rule is as a period of time where you're ignoring your ex, you cut off all conceivable communication after this breakup, but the intent should not be used to make them miss you. Instead, it should be used to rebuild your own life so that you can outgrow your ex. And by doing this, the no contact rule can have that added benefit of making an ex miss you, which is just gravy. Right? So ultimately, here's what I suggest to you. If you're in a situation where you're at this crossroads determining whether you should be trying to get over your ex or trying to get your ex back, is always to do a no contact rule and actually use the no contact rule in a way so that you're trying to outgrow your ex. And then make that decision on which crossroads you should be going down when you're at a place where you have outgrown your ex. You're at a place where you have shifted your anxious attachment style to a more secure one, where you know, hey, I'll be okay. And at that point, you'll be happy with whatever decision you decide to make.